Derek Shelmerdine's here. Derek, welcome.
Thanks. Hi, Dave. Great to be back.
I'm really looking forward to this, dear listener. What we're going to do is once a month. I don't know what Thursday of the month it will be, but we're going to do some kind of musical history, musical genre, musical group. Tonight, I said to Derek, before we came in, I said, you choose it, and we'll just go with the flow. And he wanted to do Cream. For a start, Derek, why did you choose Cream?
I think they're probably the best band that ever walked the face of the earth.
Right.
And I do like them.
Let's qualify that a little. Do you think you'd be saying that if you were 16 years old?
Absolutely. if I'd heard enough Cream.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they're just such a phenomenal band. They were the first band to be called a supergroup by the rock press. They've got, I think, one of the most interesting backstories of any group. I mean, they came out of a background that included the three doyens of British R&B, Alexis Corner, John Mayall, and Graham Bond. I mean, Jack Bruce actually played for all three. Right. You've got, in the sort of backstory, you've got knives being pulled on one musician on another. Mm-hmm. You've got Eric Clapton trapped in a nightclub in Greece, being blackmailed by the owner. You've got Ginger Baker playing on the B-side of a Who single. Yeah. So, you know, it's wide and varied.
It's a good, interesting story. It kind of like makes EastEnders look like Sunday at church, doesn't
Absolutely.
It? Well, let's go. No, okay, come on then. So we got all this to get out. Let's start right at the beginning. Where did it all? Where's the genesis of it?
Well, I think it's a good idea to look at what Clapton was doing initially for his first two or three bands, and then moving to what Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker were doing, because Clapton started out his very first band down in London, in a band called the Roosters, sort of early to middle 1963. So we're right at the beginning.
Was this a Surrey-based sort of out of school kind of band?
Exactly. And there was a mate of his called Ben Palmer. I mention that because probably very few people have ever heard of Ben Palmer, but if you're an Eric Clapton fan, he pops up time and time again working with Eric Clapton. And the other interesting thing about that was Tom McGuinness, later Manfred Mann fame, was also in the Roosters. Right. Clapton moved on, and he joined another London band called Casey Jones and the Engineers. Now, what's interesting about that is, one, he was only there for about 7 gigs in the autumn of 63. Yeah. But Casey Jones was actually a guy called Brian Casser from Liverpool. So we go straight into a Beatles situation, because Brian Casser was the Cass of Cass and the Casanovas, a very, very popular Liverpool band in the early 60s. And they were doing, on the 10th of May, 1960, both the Beatles and the Cass and the Casanovas were auditioning for Larry Parnes to back Billy Fury, who's had a UK tour on the horizon. Now, at that gig, the Beatles drummer, Tommy Moore, was late, so Johnny Hutchinson of the Big Three stepped up and took the stool. Didn't help because the Beatles failed their audition. So I think when John Lennon, if you ever watch the Get Back rooftop performance, says, I hope we passed the audition. Yeah. That was a good accent, wasn't it?
Very good.
He could well be referring to the fact that they did fail that, as well as their Decca audition some years later. So it didn't go all swimmingly for the Liverpool lads. But what happened was Brian Casser decided he'd try his luck in London, and the remaining guys there became the Big Three, and he went down to London. And after a handful of gigs, Clapton decided he wanted to move on and join a real blues band. Yeah. So if we sort of leave Clapton there for a sec, we go to Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, because their story is tied almost all the way through until they joined Cream. Yeah. And they've both got a jazz background. I mean, Ginger Baker was in bands like the Storyville Jazzmen and Terry Lightfoot, which are well-known trad jazz bands at the time. Jack Bruce, being up in Scotland, was in a band called Murray Campbell Big Band. Not quite so well known, perhaps.
I tell you something, we're getting some wonderful names coming out. Oh, if nothing else.
Exactly, it never really stops. But then they both came together in Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated, And now we shoot off into a Rolling Stones.
Someone like Alexis Corner was a real linchpin for so many sort of bands like that.
Absolutely,
and musicians, wasn't he?
I mean, he really should be a topic. One of the
absolutely, we can perhaps in a few months' time. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
But what's interesting about that is that Ginger Baker replaced Charlie Watts, who was the original drummer with Alexis Corner.
What happened to him?
Well, it gets even more incestuous at that point. Because what happened, he's only a semi-pro at this point,
right.
Charlie Watts. He went off to join Brian Knight in Blues by Six. Now, Brian Knight was in Brian Jones of Rolling Stones fame's first ever lineup. And when Brian Knight left Brian Jones's first ever lineup, he recruited Charlie Watts from Alexis Corner. So, the whole thing just keeps going around in a circle. And it was the second lineup that Jagger and Richards joined, and they went on to become the Rolling Stones. So it was really then that they met Graham Bond. And towards the end of the time, so this is sort of early 63, they were gigging then as the Graham Bond Trio whilst they were still in the sort of moonlighting, if you like, while they were still in Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. And the way they left was fun because Graham Bond decided that they'd go off on their own. So without telling either Bruce or Baker, he went along and told Alexis Corner that they were all leaving. And Bruce and Baker were a bit aghast, but moved on, and they became the Graham Bond organisation, basically. So, it all very much ties in together. And along the way, John McLaughlin joined, and they became the Graham Bond Quartet. Yeah. So it's interesting how you keep all the time finding links into other bands. While they were the organisation, they actually backed Duffy Power on I Saw Her Standing There. So another sort of Beatles link in. Didn't do too well. Graham Bond's one of those bands that never really quite managed to crack the commercial side.
Of the three, Alexis Corner, John Mayall and Graham, I mean, personally, he's the one who seems to be the one in the background.
That's
a bit more.
Very much. People tend to think of Mayall and Corner as the cornerstones, I was going to say, but that would be a dreadful pun. What happened? Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker now obviously working closely together, but they really didn't get on. They had on-stage fights. So famously, Ginger Baker used to build his first drum kits himself, and apparently one of these drum kits got wrecked in an on-stage fight, and eventually it was decided that because Ginger Baker was really becoming the leader of the Graham Bond organisation, he sacked Jack Bruce. But
do we know why? Well,
they really there was a lot of friction between them. They just continuously fought. He didn't like. I'm not sure they liked each other's playing styles. Yeah. But urban legend has it that the last straw came for Jack Bruce when Ginger Baker pulled a knife on him and said, "Well, if you don't go, perhaps you'll be gone forever." Yeah.
God, dear, oh dear.
So. That really brings us back then to Eric Clapton, and he moved on. As I said, he wanted to get into a real band, and after he left Brian Cass's band, he joined the Yardbirds. But what I think is quite ironic there is that he was there for a while, and he was there in the early days. He replaced Top Topham, the first ever, the original guitarist.
Yeah. Whose daughter we've had in here.
Oh, really?
Yes, we
wow.
Did.
Yeah. Yes,
she's a great singer. She's a really good singer. She is, very good.
And while he was with the band, they recorded with Sonny Boy Williamson at the Crawdaddy, which was owned by Giorgio Gomelski, who was the Yardbirds manager and also the manager of the early Rolling Stones. So, again, it all keeps turning about.
I mean, with hindsight, when you look at this kind of family tree of cream, if you like, does it almost, when you look back at it, does it almost look obvious that they were going to get together? or is there still these little bits of sort of strokes of luck and
Well, I think with hindsight, it was the later stories is even more amazing. I mean, the fact that they were considered to be the first supergroup, and not really at that time many people heard even of Eric Clapton. I mean, the Yardbirds, yes, famous-ish, but there were no Rolling Stones. But I think that it's more the fact that they were all, because they're such good musicians, because they were working in such high-quality bands, they met each other. And later, Baker's jams with Eric Clapton on stage for the first time. I think, wow, this guy can play.
Where was that? Any ideas? Or do you know?
It was at a John Mayall gig. I can't remember where the gig was, but that was really at the end of the story when they decide then that it's probably a good idea to actually get together. But I thought what might be interesting to get the first flavour for Cream, in case there is anybody who has never really heard a lot of Cream, that we could maybe kick off with a track called Crossroads.
Yeah.
And that's actually a cover of Robert Johnson's song. Now, Eric Clapton left...
His love of Robert Johnson, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of his real big fans. So I thought it'd be interesting to...
But why this track in particular, though? Is it anything that makes it stand out?
Well, it's two or three things, really. One, it's almost the epitome of the flavour of blues that Clapton was looking to get to. He'd left the Engineers and the Yardbirds because he kept feeling they were getting too commercial. He joined John Mayall, and they were, as blues as you can actually get. Robert Johnson, who only ever had 2 recording sessions and produced about, I think it was 29 tracks, this being one of the most famous of them, is arguably the most famous of the early generation of blues singers. And it actually is amazing Eric Clapton guitar work on this. And I thought it just sort of captured a whole load of things that Clapton was aspiring towards.
That track, I mean, was that Eric Clapton going through his God era?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this is Eric Clapton's absolute pinnacle, his time spent with Cream. I think what tends to be forgotten a little bit now, at the very beginning you said, what a 16-year-old guy, think they were that good. What's difficult to imagine now is that when the Cream's first album arrived in '66, there was absolutely nothing like it. It was a completely different situation. They were following on from the likes of the Searchers and the Beat Groups and some of the early Stones R&B stuff, but there was nothing.
Were people interested in it?
Absolutely.
Or was it a slow grower?
I think it was a bit of a slow grower. I think the London scene, because it was more R&B influenced than, say, Manchester or Liverpool, I think you could argue. They probably gathered ground. And because they'd have played there, that's where they built their reputation. But I know I personally got into them on the second album, Disraeli Gears, when I sort of heard some of the other stuff. Then I heard that album, and I thought, wow.
With the first album out, what sort of places were they playing? Were they just sort of doing like the Marquee and all the smaller venues still, or was there the kind of interest in them that they were getting to the sort of bigger places already?
Well, they were the sort of bigger places then. What a lot of the bands at that time would do, they'd be on package tours with 6 or 8 different artists, and they'd do maybe a 15 minutes. I mean, the top artists would probably do about a 20-minute set, and the first guy would probably only do about 2 numbers, but typically do about 15-minute sets. I mean, I saw the Rolling Stones at Chester Gaumont Theatre in '63 on such a package, and it was looking back now, I mean, absolutely unbelievable to think how the roadies managed to sort all that out, and the changes between the
very basic equipment, though, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. I mean, at that time, it was a drum kit would be a ride, a crash cymbal, a snare drum, single bass drum, and probably one one hanging tom and one floor tom.
And quite a small PA, I would imagine, as well.
They were. Vox AC30s were the go. They were, 50 watts, 100 watts.
When you're in a place, I know we're diverting a little bit, but when you're in a place like that, was the sound adequate to fill it?
Well, what's interesting about that is you didn't really notice Because, I mean, the Beatles famously decided to stop touring because of the screaming. And I know when I saw the Stones at that time, I mean, they were screaming through, but as soon as the Stones took the stage, the screaming from every single lady in there was intense for the entire 15 or 20 minutes that they were on. But if you heard one of those concerts now, pop into a time machine, pop back, you think, wow, that's a bit muffled. But at the time, that's the best you'd ever heard. And there'd never been anything like that before.
Nothing to compare it to.
Yeah, and it was just part of the progression, really. They just got bigger and bigger and better and better, because that was what the bands all were striving for: bigger and bigger PA systems, bigger and bigger back lines,
more volume.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get back to the Cream story then.
Right. Well, I mean, now we're in around spring of '65 when Clapton decided he wanted to get into a real blues band and joined John Mayall. And he was there for a while. But that summer, he decided to form a sort of party band, as it were, and he called it the Glands. And this is where Ben Palmer pops up again. He was the pianist in this band, and they decided they were going to play around Europe. And they got as far as Greece. And they were playing this nightclub, and this nightclub owner cottoned on to the fact that they didn't actually have any documentation to be legally there and working. So he was blackmailing them. They were playing for virtually nothing. And they eventually escaped, and apparently Eric Clapton had to leave his beloved amp behind. But then he came back and rejoined John Mayall. And now Jack Bruce had moved on from from Graham Bond, and he was then in John Mayall when Clapton came back. So that's when they first played side by side. But one of life's sad little stories there was that Pete Green had joined John Mayall a week earlier as the lead guitarist. And of course, when Eric Clapton came back, he disappeared off again, although he did replace him when Clapton left to form Cream. So it was a happy ending for Pete Green at that stage.
What? So when did they actually get together as a band?
Shortly after that, they recorded they made their official debut on the 31st of July, '66. Yeah. But you still got Jack Bruce to disappear off from John Mayall to join Manfred Mann. Yeah, and he appeared on Pretty Flamingo, which is
was that the only? Is that the only one you know about?
It's the only single he appeared on. He did appear on an album and EP, but he was with them a few months. But that was his last port of call. Are there any shots of him doing that on Top of the Pops or anything? You know, I guess there must be. Pretty Flamingo was a big hit.
He was
at the time. Yeah. It was Paul Jones' last single as well with the band. Yeah. Mike Darbo replaced him shortly.
What year would that be?
Well, that would be '66.
Right.
So it was 65 maybe, the turn of the previous year before they formed Cream in mid '66. But Jack Bruce has got an not Jack Bruce. Ginger Baker's got an interesting little aspect there, and made himself a couple of bob unexpectedly. When the Who released Substitute, they'd recently moved from Brunswick to Reaction, and they decided that they'd release Substitute with a couple of B-sides, Circles and Instant Party. Why they did that, I have no idea. I never did manage to quite crack that one. But when they did release it on Reaction, the Shel Talmy, their producer at Brunswick, took an extremely dim view of this, because they'd recorded Instant Party while they were with him. So he decided that he did two things. One, he put out, well, I suppose it'd be the last, technically, one of their Brunswick singles with Legal Matter of their first album as the A-side, which I thought was rather nice, and Instant Party on the B-side. And he took an injunction against the Who, so they could not sell either of those two versions. So what they did, they re-recorded the B-side with a band called the Who Orchestra. Now, the Who Orchestra was actually the Graham Bond organisation, and they put a song out. It was Ginger Baker's had written it, Waltz for a Pig, for Graham Bond, but it hadn't been used by them. and they put that out. So the third version you can get hold of is Substitute with Waltz of a Pig, the Who Orchestra. And that's a Ginger Baker song with Ginger Baker playing and the Graham Bond organisation.
Does he get the credit for it on the song?
Oh, he certainly gets the credit, and he earned £1,350 that he spent on a car. Yeah, well, that's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money then.
That was a lot of money then. Well, it was enough to buy him a Rover 2000 and enough driving lessons to be able to drive it. Sadly, he wrote it off, coming home from the last gig with the Graham Bond organisation. But by then, he was off for cream, so he wasn't bothered.
Yeah.
And really, the last port of call with Eric Clapton, which again is pointing towards the future, is he recorded 3 tracks as Eric Clapton and the Powerhouse for an album released in America originally as What's Shakin' and beginning of June '66. Yeah. Released over here for anybody who's hunting down Clapton material as good time music. But again, Ben Palmer pops up on that on piano. So, he still figures in the story further down. Yeah. But also playing on that was Jack Bruce from Manfred Mann and Paul Jones from Manfred Mann. And Steve Winwood and Pete York from Spencer Davis. Yeah. So you can see, Spencer Davis then, Steve Winwood hooked up with Clapton at the end of Cream, of course, for Blind Faith. Yeah. So you can see all the time, as you were saying at the beginning, there's cross-fertilisation across bands and people. And that's what, for me, makes this really interesting.
So what was the final thing that actually got Baker, Bruce and Clapton together?
Ginger Baker. Like Brian Jones was essentially the guy that formed the Rolling Stones. Well, was definitely the guy that formed the Rolling Stones. Ginger Baker was the guy that formed Cream. He'd become friendly with Eric Clapton, and they had actually. Well, he'd become friendly with Eric Clapton, and he went down to I can't remember where to see John Clapton playing with John Mayall at a gig, and he stood in, and Ginger Baker then thought, "Wow, this Clapton is a pretty good guitarist," and he asked him if he'd form a band. They hadn't got a name at this stage, and Clapton said, "Yeah, love to, as long as Jack Bruce can be the bass player." Now, he had no idea that Ginger Baker had pulled a knife on Jack Bruce in the back, and they'd had on-stage fights. Yeah. But thankfully, they decided to bury the hatchet, and Cream was born.
And thankfully it was, yeah. I wonder how the relationship was. Do you think it was just we'll get on stage, like Baker and Bruce, and we don't have to see each other other than that? Or do you think they actually mellowed?
No, I think it just went from bad to worse, really.
What about the Cream reunion in 2005, was it?
Yeah, they came back for that. But again, they'd all gone their separate ways, particularly Jack Bruce. I mean, he very much opted for a solo career after that. But I mean, I think Cream is just such a legend. And, if you look at bands who weren't together for very long, I mean, they were together from, you could argue, 31st of July, 66 to the 26th November, 68. So it's only something a little over a year. Yeah. But their influence, if you look at the desperation to get tickets for that reunion concert, it would have been absolutely
How many albums
amazing.
Did they make? Actual studio? They made four albums, did they?
They made Fresh Cream when they first got together. And that was produced by Robert Stigwood, their manager. And then they recorded 3 more. Disraeli Gears, the second one. Wheels of Fire, which was 1 studio album and 1 live album. Yeah. And then they decided to quit, and the last one went out as Goodbye. Pappalardi's quite an interesting character as well, actually. He produced the last 3 albums, and he went on to be one of the founding members of Mountain with Corky Lang and West.
Felix Pappalardi. Yeah.
I love Mountain. Another power trio, but I mean, there was Leslie West is so good.
Perhaps another story for another day.
Exactly. Nantucke's Sleigh Ride must hit the airwaves
I've played it plenty of times.
But he was actually shot dead by his wife, Gail.
Pappalardi?
Yeah. And it was decided that it was an accident, but she was, sort of. She was convicted of criminal negligence homicide. She got a 4-year sentence. Right. So, she didn't get life or fry. So it was decided that perhaps it wasn't a whole premeditated thing. But, I mean, what an interesting... Fancy being Cream's producer and bassist with Mountain. What a life.
And then being shot by your wife.
And being shot by... Yeah, he must have upset her somewhere down the line. Forgot an anniversary, I expect.
Yeah, he did. He probably said her hair looked horrible, or she'd put on a few pounds, and that was it.
Exactly.
Oh, dear. Well, I tell you something, Derek, it's been fantastic, isn't it? Absolutely brilliant. The time, that half an hour, has absolutely whizzed by.
So it's gone?
It has, it's gone.
Oh, right.
Yeah. No. If you've got a little bit more to say, believe me, we've got a little bit more time if you've got a bit more going there.
Yeah, there's a couple of things, really. I mean, most of this was intended to be about how they got together, because I think that's just a fascinating
story. That's the main
story.
thing, because I think most people... certainly of our age, above 21, we kind of have an inkling of what Cream were, what they did, the music they produced, that kind of thing. Yeah. But it's the family tree that kind of led up to it, led up to the birth, if
Absolutely.
you like.
Yeah. I mean, my favourite, I think, all-time Cream is "I'm So Glad," Skip James cover. And when I was researching this, I came across this fabulous blues website that is amazing for discographies, and it suggests there are only 2 known copies of Skip James's original version, 1931 version of "I'm So Glad." But one of the things that's worth just mentioning is that on this day in 1966, Hendrix joined them on stage in London. They were at the Central London Poly, and Chas Chandler had just brought him over. The Experience were just in the process of being put together, and Hendrix asked Chandler if he'd introduce him to... do you know Clapton? He said, "Oh, yes, of course I know Clapton." But he did, as it happens, which was always good. And he got Hendrix up on stage. And apparently, they played Killing Floor, Howlin' Wolf single. Yeah. And apparently, Hendrix was really Clapton was really put out because Hendrix was just so good.
I think he went home and practiced, didn't he?
Well, there was talk of him thinking of hanging his guitar strap up after that. But can you imagine, though, Hendrix jamming on stage, Killing Floor with Cream? I mean, absolutely amazing.
Brilliant stuff. Derek, we'll have a little chat later on, and we'll do something different next month. We'll do perhaps the complete opposite. Yep. Not quite sure what the opposite is of Cream, but we'll do something different. But it's thank you so much for coming in.
I've enjoyed it.
It's been absolutely wonderful. Cream, I love Cream as well, so it's fantastic. So it's been absolutely a real pleasure.